Salutations everybody, it is Matty here today, sitting down for my review of Atlas Fallen, which is coming out on August 10th for $60 on PlayStation, Xbox, and PC. I've been playing around with this game for a couple weeks now over on PC. Shout out to Focus Home Entertainment for the very early review code, so there was no need to really crunch for this one. I had time to go through it gently, let my opinion marinate. And we're here today to talk about the latest from Deck 13, the developers of the Lords of the Fallen. Not that new one coming out this year, but the older one, as well as the Surge and the Surge 2. The Surge 2, I believe, being one of the more overlooked Souls-like games. So I was very excited for Atlas Fallen. It seemed very different. And of course, sandboarding looked really fun. So I was all in on this game, and I was happy to play through it all. But did it deliver at the end of the day? It feels like every single thing I enjoyed about this game came with a slight caveat. Doesn't make it bad, but it doesn't mean that I could have fully indulged in my enjoyment and really gone all out and said, yo, 60 bucks, no problem, go pick it up. But Atlas Fallen was a solid time when all systems were clicking together, firing on all cylinders, and I'll break down how it went wrong, how it went right. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're new here and you're into day one reviews, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing. So basically, there's this thing in this world called essence, which is demanded by a god named Thelos. And so humanity provides, as they have for centuries. Servants of Thelos run a tight ship, and so naturally they're overbearing and serve as your opposing force throughout the entire story. Eventually you're going to find a forbidden gauntlet by the name of Nile, who serves as your tour guide throughout this world as he discovers his incredibly obvious identity. You play as a custom generic MC, who is voiced by the way, and him or her, alongside the talking hand accessory, will exchange words the entire game. This sounds a lot like Forspoken, and I know you may be a little bit worried, but this kind of feels in a lot of ways like what Forspoken would have been if it wasn't, in my opinion, a colossal failure. I don't mean to tear down other games to speak about another, but truthfully, it has Forspoken vibes if it were really working well in the story department. So yeah, you're going to hear a lot of back and forth between the gauntlet and the main character. The voice work, I think, is pretty subpar, which drags it down, but the relationship is actually lifted up because as this gauntlet is learning more about itself, you're learning more about the world in tow, and so it builds upon the lore more and more. And so the conversations aren't just shit-talking sessions, they're actually pretty interesting world-building moments if you're into what's going on here. Now, it's not really a visually striking world. It has great draw distance, and it feels very large and open, but sometimes looks can be deceiving, and I'll get into why. But otherwise, for the story, you have lots of dialogue that feels like it could have been put into cutscenes, but oftentimes it'll be like a floating camera that you can just rotate around, and these are with important characters, important exchanges throughout the tale. And I found that a little bit disconnecting. It felt like they just had to go with this because it would save them production time. And overall, the story can run you 15 to 20 hours, so it's not an open world game that's going to leave you tied down for hundreds of hours, which I think is a welcome change of pace in the open world genre. So the story isn't really what you're here for, truthfully. While it's there and it exists and people will be happy about it, it's about the gameplay. This one can be played in full co-op, which I think is going to be a big deal for a lot of people. For folks like myself who were reviewing the game and I didn't know who else was reviewing it, I played solo. It works totally fine as a solo experience, but I could see this being a really fun time with a friend. So let's break down the many facets of the gameplay, because that is the true focus here. So first off, what really defines the game is the sandboarding. You're going to be sliding all over the world, and it's fun to explore movement-wise, especially when you're gaining momentum, you're upgrading your movement abilities, you get a bunch of air dashes. It feels really good at certain times. However, it can be an annoying world to navigate, especially at first, and sometimes even tedious thanks to, I'd say, unimaginative world activities, the very basic run-of-the-mill fetch quests. You also have tracking wildlife, your ceiling totems that connect from one to the other, but sometimes highlights that the game is a really good 3D platformer. You'll fight elite enemies, which are just stronger versions of the enemies you've already met. You'll have treasure maps that you can go out and discover and find hidden loot, vantage points which will identify other pieces of loot, or, you know, like your other objectives that you missed out on. But it's not like a Ubisoft type of thing where you synchronize with a point and it just dots your whole map. You just get to see it and one time and then pick your direction and go. etc., etc. So there's a lot to do here. None of it really reinvents the wheel, but because the movement's fun, it's interesting to get around and go to these things. And I always talk a lot about that point A to point B. I think of something like Spider-Man, where if your point A to point B is a ton of fun, it really lifts up the whole experience, because there's a very rare feeling in gaming of being able to just go to your objective and have a lot of fun doing it. But Atlas Fallen does manage to provide that from time to time, but I mentioned earlier that it can be annoying to navigate. Especially in the early going, the world felt very cagey. And so it's frustrating to see a seemingly boundless world with equally boundless movement as you upgrade, but it feels so boxed in. Invisible walls everywhere. None of that ability you'd find in something like a Bethesda Game Studios game where you could cheat and go up over the mountain and kind of shortcut to your objective. The game has a very strict navigation rule set, and so I think that hurts the overall really cool, fun-feeling exploration. It really wants you to have that almost journeyman-like feeling of seeing the wide-open, empty desert and just gradually sailing, sand surfing your way to your objective over the course of a couple of minutes. And that'll work for a lot of people. There's a little bit of zen to that, but make no mistake, that zen gets swiftly cut off when the combat begins, which I gotta say is pretty tough to learn at first. Like, you'll see in the footage, I die a decent amount. I'm not afraid to admit it. Like, this game was tough to grapple at times, but why was that? Well, there's a lot of moving parts here that I think are really fun for an action game. The first thing you want to take a look at is momentum. That's sort of the heartbeat, if you will, of the entire combat system. So you're going to see this blue bar on the bottom left corner of the screen. And what happens is, as you deal damage, you're going to build up momentum as you would. And you'll notice that little things will light up as I gain more and more momentum. We'll explain what that is in a little bit. But point being is, the reason gaining momentum is vital is it's going to give you access to your abilities. At the same time, however, what's happening is you're gaining essence and you're fighting wraiths who feed off this essence, and so they do more damage to you. What this means is that you can start walloping your enemies, but that doesn't matter because your enemies will hit you back 2 times harder. It's really a careful dance of being completely on the aggression, but also wanting to spend out all your abilities because you don't want an enemy to hit you way too hard. Why is the game encouraging aggression? Well, the only way that you can restore your ability to heal on the bottom right corner of the screen is if you attack the enemies, and you'll gradually rebuild your potions effectively. Now, you can rest at anvils, which will let you restore everything right off the get-go, so that's nice to have. Think of them like your bonfires, I guess. But yeah, this game wants you to get aggressive because you're going to need momentum. You're going to need to rebuild those heals. And that's what creates moments like when you're just low on health, you need one more hit to get that potion back, and you really are calculating your next move. It's there that Atlas Fallen thrives in its combat system. Now, what also happens here with momentum is, I mentioned being able to cast abilities by spending that momentum, but also eventually you'll be able to shatter enemy body parts. So you'll see a blue glow around the health bar, and if you press both triggers on your controller, what'll happen is you will smash that body part off, or you'll kill the common enemy outright. And it's that sort of rhythm that gives this combat system a heartbeat that makes it really unique, honestly. I love the idea of building up a meter and that being the high risk, high reward play that I can calculate, because it really does factor into builds. But there's more I want to get into mechanically before I talk about builds. So as I mentioned, you're going to target the body parts of larger enemies, but what's happening with these larger enemies is they're going to pack a wallop, and that's why you need to focus on your sand skin, which is parrying. So as you land parry after parry based off good timing, you will gradually freeze your enemy, or as they say in the game, crystallize your enemy. And when you crystallize them, this gives you a pretty big opening to just attack, attack, attack. Now, what happens, unfortunately, is all these bigger boss monsters end up spawning lower level common enemies. And so what happens is, not only does every boss fight start to feel kind of samey in that the mechanics of them are very predictable, but also the downfalls are predictable. Pretty much when this happens, you know that some common enemy is going to sneak up on you, because the camera in this game isn't that great. And also, the combat system feels very built for one-on-one when you're fighting typically 4, 5, 6 enemies at a time. There are moments where it feels really good and you're zipping from enemy to enemy in aerial combat, but there's times where, yeah, I really need to focus on this big boss monster who's aggressing me, and then, oh, I got hit from behind by this one common enemy. I know what happens when you complain about these types of things. Skill issue, bro. I'm telling y'all right now, this combat system does not work well with the camera. There's a failure of the handshake, if you will, from time to time. And so it's not always failing you, but it failed me enough for it to start to become a pretty big problem with the game. And it's frustrating because I mentioned aerial combat, and like that's one of my favorite parts of the game. You just can straight up not touch the ground. As long as you make contact with an enemy once, you can reset all your air dashes, your jumps. It feels really, really good at those times. But also, it's that these systems are fortified by your essence stones, your builds. So these stones effectively are slotted into your gauntlet. And what happens is you're going to find an arsenal of these stones after most major fights in the game, and they apply to a variety of 3 tiers. And the trick is your placement matters. Remember what I said about the blue momentum gauge at the start of all this and how you're gradually going to see things light up on the bottom left corner as you gain that momentum? We'll break it up into 3 tiers, and that's effectively what's happening. So if you finish filling up that first quarter of the momentum gauge, your first tier is totally online. This could be passive abilities like increased attack damage, all the way to increasing your parry window for the sand skin. But this also turns on active abilities like being able to throw your axe and hit an enemy at a distance, which can be crucial if you're trying to get that last hit in I mentioned earlier to maybe get that health jar. These systems play together really well. When it's working well, Atlas Fallen is a pretty unique experience. But what this means is that placement matters. So if you're going to put something super useful in tier 3 that you need to pull off quite often, you're going to have a tougher time. So builds matter, and not just what you use, like, oh, is this a good ability, but how you equip it too. Now, all of these can be upgraded with materials found in the open world. You go back to the smithy station and you'll upgrade them along with many other things like your equipment, which also matters. You'll have different weapons that you can pick from, like a whip, which is good for targeting multiple enemies. It's weak, but it's good for building up momentum. You'll have fists that you can use, which are good for single DPS. So if you want to solo a target and do a lot of damage, these are really good. And you could have multiple equipment sets set up so you can swap between them on the go, which is really nice and expands your overall ability palette. And then there's your armor, which so far, I gotta say, the armor in this game looks really rad. So despite some of my complaints, I mean, there's a lot of build crafting here, which I really didn't expect to be here in Atlas Fallen. So that was a pleasant surprise. And again, having this all available in co-op is a much needed boon. Is it dragged down by a, I'd say, very passionately lackluster tale with equally lackluster voice work and awkward cutscenes, or really lack thereof? Yes. This is something that's going to stand out. It's not necessarily something you're going to be sitting down to get really immersed in a good story with a set of characters. But what I will say is with the sandboarding, the momentum gauge, the essence stones, and the co-op, you got a lot here in Atlas Fallen that works really well together. And I can imagine if I had a buddy watching my back that some of these combat sessions that were likely built for co-op in mind would function much better that way rather than how I was playing it as a solo player. So I have to recognize all that. Ultimately though, Atlas Fallen is fun when things are working. I didn't find its open world particularly interesting, but getting around it can be exciting when the game isn't constantly restricting you. So like I said at the top of this review, it's a lot of caveats. It's a lot of yeah, but there's always something to offset the good here. Not tremendously so, and performance overall across the board was great. I didn't have any issues like I mentioned I did with Baldur's Gate 3 with a lot of stuttering. This again is on my 3080 PC here next to me, so it's a pretty beefed up rig, but overall it ran pretty well. So there's a lot to like about Atlas Fallen, and I think it's, as always, up to the listener on if this is something that speaks to you and that you want to go out and buy. But for me personally, based off my experience, this is a wait for like a teensy tiny sale. I think 40 bucks and you're good here. I think at that point, you can confidently buy Atlas Fallen and enjoy your time with it. I think doubly so if you're there with a friend. Otherwise, though, it's not something I feel comfortable recommending right out the gate. I enjoyed Atlas Fallen, but I didn't absolutely love it. It's just, you know, I liked it. It was all right. But a lot of cool ideas here, but I didn't find myself loving as much as really what Deck 13 had me last in love with, which was The Surge 2, a phenomenal game. So they always have great ideas here, and if they gel with you, they're really going to gel with you. So if your eyes lit up a bit at the momentum gauge and the essence stones, you should probably go ahead and pick this up, because this team is really good at finding a unique system like they did with the dismemberment and the surge and exploiting it and making it a really big, blown out of proportion thing that people latch onto. So give it a shot if that really lit your fire as I was talking about it. But for me, personally, it's a bit of a wait for a sale, and I don't think you'll regret it at all. I think there's a risk of a regret at $60, especially with how competitive things are here in August. Other than that, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I got for you here for my review of Atlas Fallen. So I'm looking forward to seeing your thoughts on this game in the comments down below. Please do fire away. Other than that, follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram. Those links are in the description down below. And a big thank you to all the patrons, all the members who continue to support the heck out of the content here. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.